We are continuing our series on the Acts of the Jewish Apostles, and we're coming now into the end of Acts chapter 11. And as we've said throughout this series, that the book of Acts' order is based on what Yeshua said to his disciples in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and through all Judah and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And so today we're going to talk about the end of chapter 11, which is after we spent 2 weeks on Acts chapter 10 and 11 with Peter and Cornelius and the first Gentiles to come to faith. And you know, there's so many things that people think they understand about the Bible that they don't realize that they're missing context. And it made me think of one of my favorite things when I was a kid, which was the Transformers. You know, the Transformers were cool because, like, it's a truck. Like, Optimus Prime is a truck, but surprise, he's also a robot alien. And the slogan for Transformers was Transformers more than meets the eye. And I think the context of the book of Acts is more than meets the eye. I think it seems to read one way, but if you then understand historical and Jewish context, then it actually reads quite different. It transforms. The Bible is so much more than what is on the page and the words on the page, because when you understand the context of the first century and the Second Temple period we've been talking about throughout this series, the context makes it more than meets the eye. And I think in our world, people have built-in assumptions in our culture when you use words like Jewish and Christian, Old Testament, New Testament. And to some degree, our job as a Messianic community is to confuse people. It's to change their assumptions. My friend Tim Ross wrote a book called Upset the World. And I think that is our job to a degree, is that we're supposed to upset the systems that we're all a part of in order to bring people back to God. Things are not as you think they are. They're actually much worse, or they're much better. But you need context to understand. And so we come then to the end of Acts chapter 11, and this is what follows after this amazing event of Peter and Cornelius. And so I want to show you in the end of Acts chapter 11 why the first Christians were Jews. That's the name of the message today. The first Christians were Jews. Because what people think they know about the Bible, Christians, Jews, Jesus, Paul, Peter, Mary, just kidding, many, Peter, Paul, and Mary, may not be wholly true. And we have an opportunity with Jewish context to help people understand these things better as they actually are. We have to know who Yeshua is and who the disciples are. You know, when you go out, meet a new person, and you go out to dinner and you get to know somebody, you ask questions like, where are you from? Where's your family from? You have to know some of the context in order to know a person. And part of what we're doing and going through the book of Acts is going through some of that context that somehow, in all different kinds of ways, got lost in the understanding of the scriptures. So I showed you last week the context of Peter and Cornelius, how Luke uses Jonah as the backdrop for the Cornelius event. And Simon Peter is the son of Jonah, who's called by God to preach to Gentiles and celebrate that God has granted repentance leading to life to everyone who calls on the name of Yeshua. And we've talked a lot throughout this series about these hyperlinks in the New Testament that you click on and they take you back to something in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so now at the end of Acts 11, Luke is actually dropping hyperlinks to his own stories, to his own history. The end of chapter 11, he hyperlinks back to Acts chapter 6, which we spent a few weeks on in the stoning of Stephen. Acts chapter 11, verse 19, it says, now those scattered because of the persecution that happened in connection with Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, telling the message only to Judeans. Now, we talked about when we went back, if you didn't listen to the messages on the stoning of Stephen, I encourage you to go back. They were called, it was 2 messages called How to Get Stoned, like Stephen. And Stephen's death was an important watershed moment because lots of things had changed. you see here, they said even still, these guys were going and preaching in the cities like Antioch, which is 250 miles north of Jerusalem, but they were still only preaching to Judeans. And they were preaching from Judea and Jerusalem to Jewish populations, even in places like Antioch. And so the people who were scattered after the persecution of Stephen are the ones doing the preaching. It says in verse 20 that there were men from Cyprus and Cyrene who came to Antioch and began speaking to the Hellenists also, proclaiming the Lord Yeshua. You remember back in Acts chapter 6, this Judeans and Hellenists were these two phrases that were actually two groups of Jewish people. The interesting thing is, in Acts 11, most translations have this, instead of Hellenist, which is the Greek word, which would translate to Hellenist, is sometimes in translations, different English translations, instead of Hellenist, it says Greeks or Gentiles. But based on what we know from Acts chapter 6, that there were these two groups of Judeans and Hellenists. The first were the Judeans who spoke Hebrew and Aramaic, and those were people they were preaching to in Hebrew and Aramaic. And then the Hellenists were people, Jewish people, from the diaspora who had come back to Jerusalem, and there were a group of 7, including Stephen and Philip, who were to preach to these Greek-speaking people because they themselves were Greek-speaking Jewish people. So here in Acts 11, even after this event with Peter and Cornelius, they're still only preaching in Hebrew to Hebrew-speaking Judeans in Antioch. And much like Stephen and Philip, when they start preaching to Jewish people who were also Hellenists as Hellenists themselves. And in a city like Antioch, then it also begins, for really the first time, the preaching of the gospel extends to Gentiles that are not connected to the Jewish world. Like we talked about, Cornelius was a God-fearer, a ger, a resident alien, and he had connections to the Jewish community. While he wasn't Jewish, he was a Gentile, he still had some kind of context. Now, in the city of Antioch, it's going to Hebrew-speaking Jews and Greek-speaking Jews, and now, after the event with Peter and Cornelius, now being extended to Gentiles. But some of those people, these Hellenists who are preaching to the Hellenists in the city of Antioch, seem to be the same, I think, the same guys that stoned Stephen. Remember back in Acts chapter 6 and verse 9, it said some of what was called the synagogue of the freemen, both Cyrenians and Alexandrians, as well as some from Cilicia and Asia, stood up and began to argue with Stephen. Well, it seems like now, here in Acts 11, years later, some of these same men from Cyprus and Cyrene were some of those people who stoned Stephen, but then they themselves became followers of Yeshua as a result of the stoning of Stephen. And like the rest of the disciples, they continue preaching. They now have extended to places like Antioch, preaching still only to Jewish people, and soon, in a few verses, to extend to Gentiles. And again, that's where Acts 11 verse 20 comes back, where it says there were some of these men from Cyprus and Cyrene who came to Antioch and began speaking to the Hellenists also, proclaiming the Lord Yeshua. It's interesting that here Luke chooses to call Yeshua Lord Yeshua instead of Messiah Yeshua or Yeshua the Messiah, that they would proclaim the Lord Yeshua. We know that the Messiah, the word Messiah, is Hebrew for anointed one. The Greek version is Christ, which is anointed one in Greek. Now, the concept of a Messiah was an idea that only made sense to Jewish people, and one who would come and rescue Israel from its oppressors, like Judah Maccabee just 150 years earlier. But they didn't preach to Gentiles the idea of a Messiah because the idea of a Messiah didn't make any sense to Gentiles. Rather, they preached Yeshua as Lord because they understood what the Lord, a Lord, was in the Greek system and in the Roman world. David Stern says, a Lord is, or the term Lord is an authoritative figure who's the final judge, and through whom, if they have faith, come forgiveness and incorporation into God's people. And at the same time, in the ancient world, Jewish people, and I find this so interesting, this was from N.T. Wright's biography on Paul, that Jewish people were actually considered atheists by Romans because they didn't believe in the gods. So not believing in the gods made them atheists. And their relationship to their God, the God of the Hebrews, was weird, man, because they didn't have like an image. And I mean, they had a temple, but there's no statues in there. And it just seems like they're different. And N.T. Wright says it like this. He says, after all, Jewish people didn't come to worship the gods. They didn't turn out for the great festivals. They didn't come to the parties at the temples. And they didn't offer animal sacrifices at local shrines. You might remember when the Roman general Pompey marched into the Holy of Holies in the temple, he was actually surprised that there was no image or statue of the Jewish God. How could you worship a God without an image? The Romans and the Greeks would think. So for the Romans, atheists, like the Jews, were dangerous because, N.T. Wright says, simply because people who didn't believe in the gods were placing the city and the whole culture and the whole world at risk. If you reject the gods are going to judge us. If you reject the gods are going to punish us. And Jewish people were like, but we don't even believe in your gods. There's only one God. There's a God of, it's called monotheism. There's only one God. And this is why it's important that you understand that the first Christians were Jews. That they believed there was only one God and that he was the creator of the heavens and the earth, and that Yeshua, the Messiah, was God in flesh. More than that, he was both, at the same time, he was both the people of Israel personified in human flesh and the God of Israel in human flesh. He is both at the same time. He's a representation of Israel and the God that Israel worships. So the way to the heart of Antioch was not preaching, a city like Antioch in the Roman world was not preaching Yeshua as the Messiah because they didn't really understand what a Messiah was. But it was the idea that he was Lord over all of the gods of Rome and that the gods of Rome didn't even exist. So the city, Antioch, is, an important city in the ancient world. And I'll show you a map that I showed you a few weeks ago. Obviously, Jerusalem and Samaria. This is the region of Phoenicia where the disciples now have been pushed out from Jerusalem, Greek-speaking disciples, into preaching in other parts of the world. Paul is from Tarsus, which is in Cilicia. Barnabas, who we'll talk about in a minute, is from Cyprus. And here, 250 miles north of Jerusalem, in the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, is the city of Antioch. It was a crossroad and a training center not far from the coast. And because of its position between east and west, it became an important city. It also had a large Jewish population. So the disciples, hearing all the things that are going on from Jerusalem in Antioch, they actually send Barnabas to go to preach and to check everything out. Acts 11 and verse 22 says, news about these things reached the ears of the community in Jerusalem as they sent Barnabas to Antioch. And when he arrived, he saw the grace of God and he was thrilled. And he encouraged them all to remain true to the Lord with heartfelt devotion. For Barnabas was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a large number was added to the Lord. Now, Barnabas is this important character that has shown up in Acts, but we haven't talked much about. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 36, it says, now Joseph, also called Barnabas by the emissaries, which is translated son of encouragement, was a Levite and a native of Cyprus. Okay, that's a lot of information about this guy. His name is Joseph in Hebrew. He is called Barnabas because apparently he was a very encouraging person, so they called him the son of encouragement. But he's also a Levite. He's from the tribe of Levi. His family was a part of the priesthood, but he was also a native of Cyprus. So it sounds like was born outside of Israel and in the diaspora. Clearly also a Greek-speaking Jew because he was from Cyprus. And so they gave him the name Son of Encouragement, and it's it's Barnabas who is the one, when we spent a couple weeks in Acts chapter 9 and the non-conversion of Paul, that he was the one that vouched for Paul to the apostles. Acts 9 verse 26 says, when Saul arrived in Jerusalem, he made attempts to join up with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took him and brought him to the emissaries, and described to them how Saul had seen the Lord on the road, and the Lord had spoken to him, and how he had spoken boldly in the name of Yeshua. So Barnabas was this Greek-speaking Levite from Cyprus. And remember, Paul was, at this point, was in Tarsus for around 10 years. We're talking about now, we're in the year like 46 or 47, where the road to Damascus was around the year 36. It's 10 years later. And during those 10 years, Peter and Cornelius happened. While Paul was in silence, studying and reading and rereading in Tarsus, the Cornelius event happened. And surely Barnabas told Paul about what happened. And I would imagine it confirmed what Paul had already come to understand in his studies in isolation regarding the Gentiles. That Paul was this Hebrew, Greek-speaking Jew from Tarsus who was a Pharisee, and Barnabas was this priest, a Levite from the city of Cyprus. So the two of them form an incredible partnership, and Barnabas then goes to get Paul in Acts 11, verse 25. It says, "Then Barnabas left for Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for a whole year they met together with Messiah's community, a large number. And it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians." Christians. This is interesting because there's only 3 places in the New Testament where the word in Greek, Christioni, is used and translated Christians. And Christian would mean like Christ people in Greek, or in Hebrew would be Mashiach people, like people who believed in the Messiah. Now, both words I already said, and you may already know, that Christ and Messiah are words in Greek and Hebrew that mean anointed one. And there's no evidence in the text that the disciples of Yeshua ever called themselves Christians. The 3 times the word Christian is used, they're being called Christians by outsiders, like those Jesus freaks, those Christ followers, those Jesus people, 3 times in the New Testament. The same word is used when King Agrippa, later on in the book of Acts, in Acts 26 and verse 28, and it's translated as Messianic in a Messianic translation, but it says Agrippa said to Paul, "In a short time you're trying to persuade me to be a Christian." Like Agrippa was a king who was not Jewish and who understood, you're trying to get me to be one of these Jesus people. Peter, who writes to Jewish followers of Yeshua and encourages them in his letter of 1 Peter, when people call you Christians, count it as good, because I know they mean it bad, right? 1 Peter 4, verse 16, "If anyone suffers for being a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in his name." Or back here, the other place is back in Acts 11, verse 26. And it was Antioch that was the first place that the disciples were called Christians. The disciples, the Jewish disciples, are called Christians by outsiders. They didn't call themselves Christians. It's what they were called by other people, which is why I keep trying to tell you that the first Christians were Jews. The name makes sense. It means the ones who believe that Jesus is the Christ. Christ is not his last name. It's a title. And it's the Greek equivalent to Mashiach, Messiah, the anointed one. This is why I call myself a Messianic Jew. Part of the difficulty of the last 2,000 years is that there's been persecution by Christians and the church in the name of Christ that forced Jewish people to become Christians, which means really not Jewish. When Jewish people hear the word Christian, they hear not Jewish. In fact, people, both Jews, Christians, and people that don't believe in the Bible at all, will often ask me, how can you be Jewish and believe in Jesus? Doesn't that make you a Christian? Well, the answer is no and yes. I am a Christian in the sense that I follow Jesus as the Christ, or Yeshua as the Messiah. But I am not a Christian if you think that means I'm no longer Jewish. For the majority of both Jews and Christians, that's what it actually means in the world we live in today. Christian means I follow Jesus and rejected Judaism to become a part of Christianity. But that's not what it is. And it sounds like semantics. It is semantics, and semantics can't be ignored. There was a movement that we're connected to as Messianic Jews called Hebrew Christianity in the late 1800s. And they were Jewish people who followed Jesus, and they called themselves Hebrew Christians. Now, growing up, I was taught that this was not good because we're not Christians and we shouldn't identify that way. What I found out actually through my brother Jake, who's a rabbi, a Messianic rabbi at Adat HaTikva in near Chicago, in his PhD dissertation, he did research on Hebrew Christians. And he found that Hebrew Christians were just like us. And in some cases, they were Hebrew scholars who understood themselves as Jews. It's the reason why they called themselves Hebrew Christians. The difficulty is, in the time we live in, nobody really calls themselves Hebrews, except groups that aren't Jewish. It makes more sense now, I think, to call oneself a Messianic Jew. But some prefer Jewish Christian. Similarly, I was taught and raised that you shouldn't call yourself a Jewish Christian. But I think the point here is that someone who has a Jewish parent or a grandparent, Jewish grandparent, should identify as Jewish in some way. So we, Jewish people that follow Jesus, started calling ourselves Messianic Jews. It means the same thing as Christian. It's just from Hebrew instead of from Greek. It means I am a follower of the Messiah Yeshua, and I'm still Jewish. Still. Just like Yeshua. Just like the apostles. Just like Paul. Sometimes people ask, if I attend a Messianic congregation, what should I call myself? And this is a great question because identity actually matters. And for those who are Gentiles who attend a Messianic congregation, I want to suggest to you two options that you could call yourself because identity matters. You could call yourself a Messianic Gentile or you could call yourself a Gentile Christian. I highlighted Messianic and Christian because you could just drop Gentile and just call yourself Messianic or Christian. But it's important that you know who you are. It makes total sense to call yourself a Christian or a Gentile Christian. And if you don't have a Jewish parent or a Jewish grandparent, please don't call yourself Jewish. Even if you're 1% Semitic from your 23andMe, and even if you have Jewish heritage from 14 generations ago, it's okay. You are who you are. God doesn't make any mistakes. Being a Gentile is not a bad thing. You can go back to the message called Gentiles in Acts chapter 10. It means the nations. It's good. It's a part of what God did. He separated the Jewish people from the nations. If you're a Jewish person who follows Jesus, I'll similarly give you two options to call yourself. You can call yourself a Messianic Jew or a Jewish Christian. And I highlighted Messianic and Christian because you could just call yourself Messianic or Christian. The point is, if you're Jewish, it makes sense to call yourself to identify as Jewish. If you have a Jewish parent or a Jewish grandparent, then you should call yourself Jewish because that's what you are, whether you attend a Messianic congregation or you're a Jewish person that attends and is a part of a church. A people separated from the nations to bless the nations, we should identify that way. After all, the first Christians in the book of Acts were actually Jews. The reason is both Jew and Gentile matter. And Antioch, this place in modern-day Syria, 250 miles from Jerusalem, is really the first place where communities begin to be filled with both Jewish followers of Yeshua and Gentile followers of Yeshua as they live and worship together. Now, all of us have to be careful that we don't make identity an idol. We can care too much about our identity. But I think in the world that we live in right now, most people don't really understand their own identities. And we have to hold with open hands the idea that we are not the definers of what identity means for everyone. But we can start with understanding our own identity so we can help others understand their identity. It's why we keep saying, and I said throughout this series, that we want to reach people, and people equals everyone. And everyone, for me, is Jew and Gentile. And we've said, because I say it every week, we are people who have struggled to belong, people who want to help others move from unsure to secure in their identity. And that's why we help people, Jew and Gentile, discover who Jesus really is so that we can find a hope-filled identity in him. This is a new idea for us at Restoration within 2022. This is an idea that we are trying to understand. How can we help people, Jew and Gentile, discover who Jesus really is so that they can find a hope-filled identity in him? That's why we keep saying throughout this series and have throughout this year that we want to help people know God, find freedom, discover purpose, and make a difference. And there's ways that we can do that within our Shabbat gathering and our app, within our connect groups and our growth tracks, and our dream team as our volunteers. And all of that is in the process of hope. And you can pray with us that we've, as a result of COVID and all kinds of other things that have happened in the world, we are rebuilding community in Seattle and rebuilding all of these different things so that we can help people be who they are called to be. Last week in my message on Peter and Jonah, I said it this way. We want to see lost people saved. We want to see saved people pastored people trained, and trained people mobilized. Everything starts with people coming to know Yeshua here at Restoration, in person and also through our app and online. And we want to see those people who know Yeshua be pastored in who they are and their gifts and their talents and their identity. And then we want to try to train people to use those gifts and mobilize people to use those gifts, not just at Restoration and for Restoration, but for the larger body of Messiah. In order for the scriptures to be true, there has to be both Jew and Gentile who worship Yeshua. It's the design of God. There's two parts of the same people. Jewish people who follow Yeshua, like Yeshua and the apostles and Paul and Barnabas, all of the OGs. But there also has to be Gentile followers of Yeshua that remain Gentiles as a fulfillment of prophecies going all the way back to Abraham. Because we're one body and one family with two parts. Because we believe that everyone belongs in the family of God. And everyone is defined as Jew and Gentile. And the family of God is my preference for what we call ourselves. Some say the body of Christ or the church. But biblically, I think the right phrase is the family of God. Because when people ask, what are you? The answer is a little more simple than even all of the titles I've given you. The answer we can all answer with, what kind of exactly are you, is I am a Messiah follower. That's who I am. I believe that Yeshua, that Jesus is the Messiah, and that means something, and I do my best to follow him, and I'm not good at it. In fact, I'm terrible at it. But because of his grace and mercy, because he offered himself as a sacrifice for us, just like several of the holidays that the Lord gave the Jewish people, he makes a way for us to become more like him. And you can qualify what kind of Messiah follower you are. We can all say, I am a Messiah follower, and then we quantify or clarify that we're either a Jewish or a Gentile Messiah follower, because we follow Yeshua, who is both Lord for the Greeks, the Gentiles, and the Messiah for the Jews. He's both for everyone. But there's an avenue of explanation that helps people understand so that they can understand the rest. It's for Gentiles and it's for Jews. It's together. So the Acts 11 continues in verse 27, and it says, now in those days the prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and predicted that through the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine over all the world. This famine took place during the reign of Claudius. It's interesting because this famine actually happened historically in Rome around 46, 47 CE, according to the historian Josephus and others. And then Paul and Barnabas in Antioch then take money back to Jerusalem. Well, this is the first time that Paul had been back to Jerusalem since his 2-week trip 14 years ago in order to bring money to this from this multi-ethnic community in Antioch to help the original followers of Yeshua in Jerusalem with the famine. Verse 29 of Acts 11 says, so the disciples decided to send relief to those brothers and sisters living in Judea, each according to his own ability. And this they did, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. Now this trip to Jerusalem corresponds with what Paul writes in his letter Galatians, which is his earliest letter, verses 1 to 10. And in Galatians chapter 2, verse 1, it says, after 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus with me. Because of a revelation, I went up and presented to them the good news that I proclaim among the Gentiles. But I did so privately to those who seemed to be influential, to make sure that I would not run or had not run in vain. Yet, not even Titus, who was with me, a Greek, was forced to be circumcised. Now, this issue came up because of false brothers secretly brought in who slipped in to spy out our freedom in Messiah in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not give in even for a moment, so that the truth of the good news might be preserved for you. The you here is for Gentiles in the region of Galatia. And the idea is the first Christians were Jews. But Paul, after the Peter and Cornelius event, and after being gone for 10 years, shows up again with Barnabas in Jerusalem. And according to his own words, they bring this young man with them named Titus, who's a Greek, not Jewish. And here in Galatians 2, Paul celebrates that Titus, who was with me, a Greek, was not forced to be circumcised. Well, why? Because he's a Greek. He's not Jewish. There's no need. In fact, we'll get to later after the Jerusalem Council in Acts 16, where Paul takes Timothy, a son of the faith, to be circumcised because he's Jewish. So are you telling me that Paul did different things for different people? Yes. For a Gentile, he celebrated that he was not tricked into being circumcised. And for a Jewish person who had a Greek father who was not circumcised, he took him to be circumcised. And there's these false brothers that he talks about who come in to deceive them. And he says, but we weren't deceived for your sake, so that we could preach the gospel to you. Now, we're going to come back to these things after the high holidays. The next three messages that we'll share will be messages for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And then we will pick up after the holidays in Acts chapter 12 and get into the nitty-gritty of circumcision, which most people don't talk about because they don't understand, and they don't understand the importance and the foundational issue that circumcision is. And it's weird to talk about penises in synagogue or church, but there is a deeper connection to why these things actually matter for all of our faith. As the importance of circumcision as a sign of the covenant with Abraham for his physical descendant. Not for Gentiles, never for Gentiles. And the disciples understand that. And as we go through the book of Acts, we'll explain it in order to help people understand their identity. So Paul continues in Galatians, talking about the same trip in Jerusalem, and he says in Galatians 2 and verse 6, he says, but those from who seemed to be influential, whatever they were makes no difference to me, because God shows no partiality. Those influential ones added nothing to my message. On the contrary, they saw that I had been entrusted with the good news for the uncircumcised, just as Peter was for the circumcised. For the same God who is at work in Peter as an emissary to the Jews also was at work in me as an emissary to the Gentiles. And realizing the favor that had been given to me, Jacob, or James, and Peter, and John, who were the recognized pillars, shook hands in partnership with Barnabas and me, so that we would go to the Gentiles, and they to the Jews. And they asked only that we remember the poor, something I was already eager to do. And so, quickly, Paul is explaining that, look, Peter is an apostle to the Jews. He's an apostle to the ones who were circumcised. But Paul understood himself as an apostle to the Gentiles, to those who were uncircumcised. But again, Peter preached to the first Gentile, Cornelius, and Paul preaches in synagogues in every Gentile city he visits. It was never either or. It was both and. They helped both groups understand their identity so that they could do the things that they're called to do. And in a city like Seattle, in the very ends of the earth, our job is to preach Yeshua as both Lord and Messiah. For Jewish people, Yeshua as the Messiah. For Gentiles, we preach Yeshua as Lord. It's both and. It's not either or. What you call yourself matters, because history matters, and context matters, and semantics matter. But don't make identity an idol, because we all have done that, and we probably all will do it again. But the truth is, when you follow Yeshua, you are a Yeshua follower, a Jesus follower. You can be a Christian. You can call yourself Messianic. You could be a Messianic Jew or a Gentile Christian, but understand that we are all one family together in the name of Yeshua. And the truth is, the first Christians were Jews, and there are still Jewish people who follow Yeshua as the Jewish Messiah today. And we'll continue the Acts of the Jewish Apostles, and we pick up our series in Acts following Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I can't wait to celebrate the Fall High holidays with you in person or online, and to sound the shofar and eat apples and honey and do all the things that we do. I love you, and we will see you next week.